Good day. Well, the much build-about summit meeting between President Putin of Russia and President Biden of the United States has now taken place in Geneva. And what general conclusions about it can we draw? Well, I'm going to make a few very quick observations. Firstly, the most interesting and salient fact about the summit meeting was that it was extremely short. It was billed to last for 5 hours, which is already a relatively short time, given the enormous complexity of the issues between the United States and Russia, but it only lasted for 3.5. The two leaders at the end of the summit meeting then went ahead and gave separate press conferences, in which I will discuss shortly, and they also published a joint statement on strategic stability, also very short, which I will also discuss shortly. There does not seem to have been any more substantive agreement coming out of this summit meeting. Now, I think that this reflects the way in which this summit was actually set up. It was the product of the events in Ukraine in April. If we all go back to what was taking place in Ukraine at that time, over the course of January and February, the ceasefire on the contact line between Ukraine and the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, progressively began to break down. Ukraine was at that time enacting various very aggressively worded laws, which essentially spoke about the need to reincorporate Ukrainian territory back into Ukraine, but in a way that seemed to allow no substantive scope for negotiations. And of course, Ukraine deployed a large number of its forces to the contact line also. That, in turn, provoked a massive counter-reaction from the Russians, with a huge and very rapid deployment of a very large combat force made up of 2 army groups and an airborne force, as well as aircraft and naval assets in and around Ukraine. And with talk from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that if there was to be a war in Ukraine, then Ukraine might not survive it. So it was a period of great tension in Ukraine and indeed in Europe at that time. And in the middle of all of this, President Biden of the United States called President Putin and proposed a summit meeting. And this summit meeting was couched as part of a request for a de-escalation of the situation in Ukraine, with President Biden also confirming to President Putin that the deployment of US warships to the Black Sea, which was due to take place to support Ukraine, would not take place after all. In other words, the summit was suggested in order to fix an immediate problem that looked like it was about to escalate out of control. That problem was Ukraine. To that extent, the summit meeting has actually worked. The Ukrainians were persuaded to call off whatever military plans they might have had in eastern Ukraine, and the Russians responded in turn by withdrawing some, though it seems not all, of their troops from the border with Ukraine. However, that has left the issue of what to do with the summit now that de-escalation has taken place unresolved. And what we have had ever since, in consequence, is a summit in search of a purpose, in search of an agenda. And though there were discussions in advance of the summit, especially between the two national security advisors, Nikolai Patrushev, who is Putin's national security advisor, and Jake Sullivan, who is President Biden's national security advisor, to find something of substance that the two leaders could talk about. It's clear from the outcome of the summit that they could come up with very little. And that explains why the summit meeting has been very short and why its results have been so meagre. When you set up a meeting without a purpose, it tends always to collapse in on itself and to become a meandering exercise in discussions, which is what this particular summit meeting seems to have essentially amounted to. Now, having said that, when two powerful men like the President of the United States and the President of Russia meet, something has to happen. And we have indeed seen a small amount of progress on a limited number of issues. Now, I want to emphasize small amount of progress and limited number of issues because it's quite clear that there was no agenda in this summit for any great overarching change in the geopolitical environment. I say that because in advance of the summit, and touched on in videos which I have done for this channel, there was talk that the United States would use the summit to try to create problems or tensions between China and Russia, to persuade the Russians that the alliance with China that they're now drifting into is bad for them or dangerous for them in some way, and to warn them that if they persist with that alliance, then they will come up with tough retaliatory action from the United States, with an offer also of a bribe in the form of vast investments in Russia from the new infrastructure fund that the G7 was busy setting up at its summit meeting in Cornwall a few days ago. Well, if that was the intention, if it had been the plan to bring up all these topics at the summit meeting between Putin and Biden in Geneva, then it's clear that that plan had already bitten the dust before the two presidents even met. The reason for that is not complicated. The Russians have repeatedly made clear that they're not prepared to be either intimidated or bribed out of their friendly relationship with China simply because the United States wants that. This was made entirely clear, crystal clear by Putin in these really very fiery interview with NBC television, and of course it's also been made equally clear by Ambassador Denisov of Russia, the Russian ambassador to China, in discussions that Ambassador Denisov has had with the Chinese media. The Russian-Chinese strategic partnership is not up for negotiation with the United States. And the Americans, I think, understood that in advance of the summit, and as a result, very little about it seems to have been said. Very little, by the way, is not the same as nothing. We do have this following comment at the press conference from President Biden. This is the press conference that President Biden gave after the summit meeting. And this is what he said about Russia's relationship with China. And I will quote it. "I think that the last thing Putin wants now is a Cold War. Without quoting him, which I don't think is appropriate, let me ask a rhetorical question. You got a multi-thousand-mile border with China. China is moving ahead, hell-bent on election, as they say, seeking to be the most powerful economy in the world and the largest and the most powerful military in the world. You're in a situation where your economy is struggling. You need to move it in a more aggressive way in terms of growing it. And I don't think he's looking for a Cold War with the United States." So what essentially Biden seems to be saying there is that he said to Putin, look, You've got the Chinese on your doorstep. Their economy is growing at an incredibly fast rate. Their military is becoming increasingly powerful. You need us to protect you from them. This is something, by the way, that Americans repeatedly say about the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership. I think it is a radically wrong interpretation of the way the Russians perceive China. I don't think they perceive China as any sort of threat to themselves. I don't think they're concerned about China in the way that the United States thinks they are. But it seems that that is what Biden tried to say to Putin over the course of this summit meeting. And I think that is as far as it went. As I said, as far as the Russians are concerned, their friendship with China is not a subject of negotiation. So that's that issue set aside, if you like. Now, if you go to the Western media, especially the Anglo-American media, you would think that the other big issue that actually was discussed at the summit was Alexei Navalny and human rights. In fact, all the headlines that I read in the British and American media after the summit meeting seem to be almost entirely focused on Alexei Navalny. I'm going to make a guess. Obviously, I wasn't listening in on the conversations, but I strongly suspect that if Navalny was brought up, which I suspect he must have been, he was sorted out and dismissed very quickly. Putin will have swatted away the topic of Navalny, as he did in his press conference and in his interview with NBC, saying once again that this is not a topic for negotiation, and saying once again that as far as he's concerned, the United States, because of its terrible human rights record, at least as he sees it, is in no position to lecture Russia on human rights. He was, by the way, at it again at his press conference, where he brought up the topic of Guantanamo and the US practice of extraordinary rendition. So that, I think, is more that would have been said about Navalny, and we get the impression that Biden himself, from his press conference, that Biden himself didn't want to discuss that issue very much, because again, he would have known, Biden would have known, and the Americans would have known that if they did indeed try to focus the entire summit meeting around Navalny and human rights, the entire summit meeting would not have lasted 3.5 hours, but would have probably lasted no more than 10 minutes. So, not China, not human rights, not Navalny. What then did the leaders discuss in substance over the brief 3.5 hours that they spoke? Well, it seems to me that it's clear that there was some progress on 3 issues. One is cyberspace, one is the Arctic, and the third is the strategic arms issues, the question of nuclear war. An important topic which was also talked about, but where no real progress clearly was made, was Ukraine. Now, I can't emphasize too strongly how important Ukraine is from a Russian point of view. Ukraine, after all, borders on their country. It was once part of the Soviet Union and of the Tsarist Russian Empire, and the Russians are extremely concerned about what goes on in Ukraine. They got Biden to recommit the United States to the Minsk Agreement, which of course requires Ukraine to talk directly to the leaders of the 2 Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. But the Russians clearly have elicited no promise from Biden or from the Americans that the United States would put any sort of pressure upon Ukraine to actually abide by those commitments. As far as the Russians are concerned, that leaves the whole situation in Ukraine unresolved. They have clearly told the Americans, not just at this summit meeting, but in previous discussions, that the topic of Ukraine joining NATO is, as far as they're concerned, a red line, and the Americans seem to have accepted that. But again, it's not something that will have been brought up in any detail in this summit meeting. Putin made it clear over the course of his press conference that the question of Ukraine was talked about, but not in great detail. So that suggests that on this issue, which is so central to the Russians, no real progress was made, and that, incidentally, all but guarantees that relations between the United States and Russia will continue to remain extremely tense. So what about those other three topics, cyberspace, strategic arms, and the Arctic, where some progress was made? Well, here I must make one very initial observation. To the extent that these are topics of importance, they are topics where the Russians have formulated their views more clearly, perhaps, than the Americans have done. And perhaps one can see that the Russians have gained somewhat more from the summit than the Americans have. That's partly, I think, a reflection of the way in which this summit was set up, in a hurry by the US, without any very clear agenda or idea of what the summit would be for once the immediate pressing crisis in Ukraine had been de-escalated. By contrast, the Russians did have an agenda on some of these topics, and they were able to some extent to push it forward, though one mustn't overstate the extent to which they were able to do that. Let's talk about cyberspace first. We learn that President Biden came along and presented President Putin with a list of 16 important US organizations, entities, call them what you will, which the United States regards as being off limits for cyber attacks and presumably for cyber intrusions. And he's made it very clear to the Russians that it is a red line for the United States if these entities are indeed hacked or cyber attacked in some way, and that if Russia were to be caught launching attacks, cyber attacks on these entities, then there would be an American response, though it's not clear what that response would be, but Biden sort of implied that it would be a cyber response. Well, I have to say, I find that a very bizarre and very strange suggestion for the US to put to the Russians. And the reason I find it strange is because identifying 16 entities, organizations, areas of industry, goodness knows what, to the Russians and saying that these are off limits for cyber attack, all but says that everything else in the United States, except these 16 entities, is not off limits. It could almost be said to actually invite attack upon the United States. Well, I'm being a little facetious because, of course, I'm quite sure that that is not what President Biden actually intended, but it again shows how muddled US thinking actually is on this issue. Anyway, what we learn, especially from Putin's press conference, is that the Russians and the Americans have agreed to talk for the first time seriously about cybersecurity with each other. We don't know the extent or the venue or the nature of these discussions, and clearly we're nowhere close to a cyberspace treaty of the sort that the Russians have been proposing for a long time. But at least we have some level of discussion and contact about this. I suspect what may have crystallized the American thinking on this topic was that event with the Colonial Pipeline, bizarre and outlandish though it was, which, if it did nothing else, it exposed how fragile and vulnerable US infrastructure is to a cyber attack. So the Americans have agreed to talk, which is what the Russians have been asking for a very long time, but that doesn't mean that they're negotiating a cyberspace treaty, and realistically, I don't think that's going to come anytime soon. Then there was a discussion about strategic stability, and here I'm going to read the very brief statement that was published and as it appears on the White House website. We, President of the United States of America, Joseph R. Biden, and President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, note the United States and Russia have demonstrated that, even in periods of tension, they're able to make progress on our shared goals of ensuring predictability in the strategic sphere, in reducing the risk of armed conflicts and the threat of nuclear war. The recent extension of the New START Treaty exemplifies our commitment to nuclear arms control. Today, we reaffirm the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. By the way, those words, the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, date back to the Gorbachev-Reagan era. They were first, as I remember, enunciated then, and here we see for the first time for a long time that they've come back, and I suppose that is progress of a kind. Anyway, to continue with this short statement, consistent with these goals, the United States and Russia will embark together on an integrated bilateral strategic stability dialogue in the near future that will be deliberate and robust. Now, the word strategic stability dialogue is all capitalized, specifically the letter D in dialogue is capitalized. Through this dialogue, capital D, we seek to lay the groundwork for future arms control and risk reduction measures. Now, note again, this is not a negotiation. The United States and Russia are not at the moment negotiating limits or reductions in their strategic arms. They're simply opening a dialogue to see whether that might be possible in the future, but probably the priority at the moment is in the risk reduction measures that are discussed at the end of this very brief statement. And that is exactly what perhaps I anticipated in that program I did a short while ago about Russia's new terrifying Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone. The Russians have been introducing a whole range of new weapon systems. The avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, which can reach the United States within 7 minutes. The Brestvenik supersonic cruise missile, which can hit the United States after being launched from Russia. And, of course, this absolutely terrifying Poseidon submarine drone, which is nuclear-powered and has a massive 100 megaton warhead, and which is intended to strike at American cities and to create massive tsunamis along the US coast, causing enormous devastation as well as nuclear fallout on a simply titanic scale. These weapon systems are deeply concerning and alarming for the United States. And as I discussed in that video, which I did on the Poseidon submarine drone, the US will be wanting to know from the Russians the circumstances in which these weapons what might be deployed in the field, especially the submarine drones, and the circumstances in which they might be used. That is what those risk reduction measures are all about. That is the nature of the dialogue at the moment. It's not so much intended, in my opinion, to work towards a treaty on strategic arms. It is intended to provide the United States with some understanding of Russian military moves with respect to these new weapon systems, so that the United States can know what sort of steps it might take which could provoke the Russians to activate these systems in a way which would be extremely dangerous for the United States. And I suspect that that is the principal purpose of the dialogue at the moment. The United States has held off from more deep-seated negotiations about limiting or reducing strategic arms because it wants to include China in those negotiations, and something which the Russians have categorically refused. I don't think that this is something that can be sorted out, certainly not quickly. I don't think either the Russians or the Americans are prepared to budge on that position. So what they want instead is a situation where at least the Americans are informed by the Russians about the circumstances when Russia's new weapon systems may be deployed, and obviously want to be alerted by the Russians about when these weapon systems are deployed. So that is what this dialogue ultimately is about. And in a sense, it is a big step forward. It is one which serves the interests of both countries. It does go towards achieving that degree of predictability in the strategic sphere, reducing armed conflicts and the threat of nuclear war that the joint statement talks about. And then, lastly, there is the Arctic. Now, the Arctic, it must be said straight away, is an area for the Russians of enormous importance. They see the development of their economy as being very much focused around the Arctic. They're busy developing the Northern Sea route, and of course they're busy also developing the various huge oil and gas fields and mineral deposits that are believed to lie in the Arctic. And they're also considering, incidentally, that with global warming, it may be possible to convert some of the area that is currently under permafrost into agricultural land, which could strengthen even further Russia's position as the world's swing food producer. So for the Russians, the Arctic is vitally important. The United States, but for its part, has recently been engaging in flesh-creeping talk about the Russians launching some kind of arms race in the Arctic and seeking to dominate the Arctic, which of course is misunderstands or overlooks the fact that Russia, with by far the greatest Arctic coastline, is almost by definition going to be the predominant power in the Arctic. Anyway, there was some sort of agreement, apparently, that the United States and Russia would talk and discuss the Arctic issues with each other, hopefully to prevent its excessive militarization and to prevent it becoming a zone of military competition between the two great powers. Incidentally, Putin was careful also to remind people at his press conference that the Northern Sea route is protected by international law, specifically by the various laws on the sea, and that interference with the Northern Sea route would be a violation of international law. So there we are, a discussion between two leaders, a discussion in search of an agenda, rather unfocused, therefore rather short, but coming up with at least a commitment to talk about two serious issues, cyberspace and strategic arms, an agreement also to reopen communications so that the United States can be more fully advised about the way in which the Russians might deploy some of the new weapons that they're developing, and also some actually good moves, it seems to me, about the Arctic, but again, all rather nebulous. All of this was apparently enough to justify the American and Russian leaders agreeing that their respective ambassadors should return to each other's capitals. And hopefully we will start to see this war of diplomatic tit for tat, of expulsions and restrictions on the embassies and the diplomats of the two countries start to ease. It's all very meagre, it's all very thin fare, but at least it's something. I don't think that this is a summit meeting which could be called any sort of inflection point, as some commentators have said. With the overriding and huge issue of Ukraine unresolved, US-Russian relations are going to remain extremely tense, and it is highly likely that there will be a deterioration, a further deterioration at some future point. But at least the two countries have moved towards a position where they are now once again talking to each other. One of the malign consequences of Russiagate was that it made any kind of dialogue between the United States and Russia all but impossible. The new president, at least, should be commended for ending that. We are back again to a situation where these two great powers, the two powers which between them possess the ability to destroy all of humanity, are once again in communication with each other. For that, at least, we should be grateful. For the rest, I think, as I've said already, that if you want to see an event which will change the direction in which events take place, you must wait for Putin's forthcoming visit to Beijing. Thank you very much for joining me on this program today. Again, I apologize if my voice and my delivery has been somewhat strained as I battle hay fever and the pollen count, which is out of control here in London. And in the meantime, I would ask you to join me in future videos on this channel, and also to join us on our on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also join us on our new platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, SuperU, and Locals. And by the way, you can also find Alex's channel both on all these new platforms and on YouTube. Last but not least, please support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar, and also support us by going to our shop, buying the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hoodies, our hats, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. Lastly, please check your subscription to this channel, and please remember to tick the like button if you like this video. And thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.